See me. Hi, I'm Josh Ginsberg. I'm the president of the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, and I want to welcome you today. Thank you for coming for our Living Sustainably with Wildfire Science for Solutions panel. I want to thank particularly the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, who are our co-hosts today. You may know who the Moore Foundation is and their tremendous philanthropy for the environment and for fire in particular. Carey Institute's a little quieter and a little less well known, so I'll give you a very short précis. We're an independent research institute, by which I mean we are not affiliated with any university. We're based about 100 miles north of New York City, and we have sort of expertise in a number of ecologies: the ecology of freshwater, forests, disease, urban systems, invasive invasion biology. Sorry, but really what we're focused on is not the what we do, but the why we do it. And we do this work, we do large-scale ecological research because we care about understanding the role of biodiversity in ecosystem function. We care about understanding the role that ecosystems play in human well-being, and maybe perhaps particularly importantly for today, understanding the resilience of ecosystems in the 21st century. The Western Fire and Forest Collaborative, which we fondly call WFRIC, is led by the Carey Institute, but is a consortium of 10 institutions with core support and partnership from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. It's doing horizon scanning research, but the research is not just theoretical research. It is deeply focused on providing better solutions for those doing policy and on-the-ground work, and for a deeper understanding of fire in a rapidly changing world. The growing risk from wildfires is particular to the West, but I think today particularly as 15,000 acres just burned in New Jersey. We had fires in Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey. The issue of fire and the impacts of fire are becoming ones that affect everybody. Obviously, you guys are ahead of us, but we're catching up. So the greatest challenge, right, is to make sure that the emerging science that we do is useful and practical for those people who are trying to get ahead of the challenges of fire in the West. And ensuring that not only is our science actionable, but that the feedback from those people on the ground for the information that we provide and the guidance we can help with is recycled and sort of creates a virtuous cycle of knowledge that helps people who are working in different parts of this, ecosystem. And really, we want to ensure that what we do is applicable and responsive to the ever-changing situation. You know, this afternoon, or I should say this evening, the panel is really a reflection of that. And we have a diverse set of expertise, and I would like to say very little else other than to welcome you again and to hand off to Crystal Raymond, who is the Deputy Director of the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative, and she'll say a few words about this remarkable panel in our discussion. So thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you, Josh, for that introduction. And as the Deputy Director of Policy and Management for the Fire Collaborative, I get to bring together the fire science community and the management community to really think about solutions together. And that's what I'm excited to do tonight for this panel. So that's what we've done. We've brought people with different perspectives on the fire crisis in the West to share their experiences. So I'll introduce our panel. First, we have Hilary Franz. She was elected to the Washington State Commissioners of Public Lands from 2017 to 2025. In that role, she led the state's wildfire response and stewarded 6 million acres of public lands, including aquatic, forest, agriculture, and residential lands. She's been recognized nationally and internationally for her work in climate change, wildfire, forest conservation, restoration, clean energy, and water. And so she'll be sharing her perspective on managing fire response and forest health in Washington's diverse landscapes. And we have Dr. Lori Moore-Merrell. She's the former U.S. Fire Administrator in the Biden administration. Prior to her appointment, Dr. Lori was the president and CEO of the International Public Safety Data Institute, which she founded after retiring from a 26-year career as a senior executive at the International Association of Firefighters. And she'll be sharing her perspective on how wildfire is affecting communities, what communities are doing to prepare, and wildfire in the built environment. And then I'll introduce our two members of the Wildfire Collaborative. So first we have Winslow Hansen. He is a scientist with the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies and director of the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative. So he leads our collaborative's efforts to produce interdisciplinary research and really leverage that research for actionable science for resource managers. And he'll share his perspective from studying multiple aspects of fire and forest resilience in ecosystems across the Western US, including Alaska. And we have Lara Kueppers. She's a professor of climate change and ecosystem dynamics at UC Berkeley and a member of the Fire Collaborative. She's a founding board member of the Climate and Wildfire Institute, and she studies climate ecosystem interactions in the Western US, and including the tropics, and she uses field experiments, observations, and models. And she'll be sharing her perspective from studying fire recovery in ecosystems here in California and Colorado as well. So as Josh said, fire, I think, is really front of mind, especially here in California. And I think that the LA fires really showed the nation the importance of living sustainably with wildfire, how we need to take action now. And I think globally as well. I mean, we really saw a fire in a place like LA, something that really resonated across the globe and had people paying attention. And so it really shows the importance of learning to live with fire or risk losing lives and property. So my first question is for Dr. Lori. So based on your firsthand experience with the aftermath of the LA fires, what are some of the lessons learned from LA, and how can we better prepare and respond to wildfires to reduce the impacts to people moving forward? And what were some of the differences compared to the Lahaina fire that provide additional insights for preparedness?
Well, thank you, Crystal. That was more than one question, but we'll start with that.
Two in there.
What an honor to be able to be with you today and to really talk with all of you and everyone online as well. The LA fires, I think, have really provided a wake-up call, and why that one and not all the others that we've seen over the past years. But it's provided for us an opportunity, I think, to have behavioral change. And that's one of the things that we learned immediately in LA, that anything we were going to do to stop the LA fires from being a disaster needed to be done long before the ignition. And so the rich fuels that were in those communities, and let me just say, the LA fire was a wildland-urban interface fire for about 5 minutes, and then it was an urban conflagration. And so the structure-to-structure fire spread that took place, and the fuel load, the radiant heat, the ember cast, these are all phrases that now the public knows. Now media says. These are things we've been talking about in our own vernacular for years, and yet now others are understanding, what does ember cast mean? And when we talk about the fuel load that was heavy, was it the same in Lahaina? Yes. Perhaps not as many structures, but the fuel load was there. The same characteristics of a fire-prone land with a community becoming the fuel. And so what we saw were heavy fuel loads in both these fires, heavy wind. You had 100-mile-an-hour winds with the Santa Anas in LA. You had hurricane gale force winds, 60-mile-an-hour plus in Lahaina. The way that the wind moved, it was fueling the structure-to-structure spread and the very limited vegetation. Though vegetation, and I say limited, it wasn't limited in that there wasn't a lot of it, there were, but not compared to a forest. And so we saw things burning for the first time in ways that perhaps people hadn't witnessed before in the structures that burned. The other thing that we have to think about in both of these fires is the evacuation. And so how were they similar? Well, in Lahaina, let me describe that one first. 102 people died. The evacuation routes were limited and they were cut off quickly by the fire and by stopped cars trying to evacuate. And so many of the people who died in the Lahaina fire died outside. They were either out on the front lawns trying to run, or they were in their cars. And so that was a lesson in and of itself about evacuation. Now, what happened in LA? Well, we only had, and I say only, compared to 102, we had 30 people that died in LA. But the evacuation was a focus of the response. Now, why is that important? Because when we talked about the response of the LA fires to start, that's what everybody focused on. What went wrong in the response? Every reporter, everybody wanted to know, we didn't have water. Where were the firefighters? They didn't show up in my neighborhood. All of these things that blame the response. We cannot response our way out of the problem that we have with wildfire. And so focusing on the response is the wrong way to go. Is it important to have a world-class response? Yes. Did LA have one? Absolutely. Resources were moved because the fire service knew what was pending. They knew what was coming. And yet we couldn't get people to react and to take care of their own properties and to take individual actions to reduce the fuel load that was in front of us. There weren't enough firefighters in the nation to have stopped what happened in LA. It was not possible. And even if they had all the water that they could use, they couldn't get it on the fire. The winds were moving it. And so it's important that people understand the real impact of what actually happened in these fires and why response, though important, is not going to get us out of the wildfire threat that we have before us. So I think it's important that we focus on community planning, that we focus on fire-adapted communities, and that we focus on reducing fuel, including having fire-resistant structures long before we have an ignition, where it is impossible for the response to keep it from being a disaster.
I think those are just really important lessons to learn, and especially when we think about wildfire from the climate perspective, and this is Climate Week, a lot of you are thinking about climate change, and when we think about climate change, we also have to acknowledge that the fire situation isn't expected to get better. And really this growing risk of wildfires is one of the most visual impacts of climate change that we're experiencing. So one of the Fire Collaborative members, scientists Park Williams and Gavin Makumbara from UCLA, did a rapid assessment of how climate change contributed to the LA fires. So Winslow, can you share a little bit about what the team found?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we hear about fire, it's often in the context of climate change. But the reality is that any specific event, and especially the LA fires, it's actually really hard to diagnose the role that climate change has played. It turns out it's quite complex. And so I'm going to tell you just briefly a little story about a research analysis that was done truly in real time. So Park and Gavin are at UCLA. They were experiencing the Los Angeles fires. And as they were experiencing the fires, they were doing the analysis to understand the causes that were driving it. And what they found is actually quite complex. So we have to go back 2 years to truly understand the biophysical causes. Turns out that 2022 to 2024 were actually quite wet years. Until about May 2024, there was a lot of precipitation, and then it got really dry really fast. So May 2024 to January 2025 was the second driest period since 1877, less than a third of an inch of rain. And so what happened is over those 2 years of wet conditions, you get a buildup of fuels, and then that dry period really brought that fuel moisture down. So we have dry conditions. That came right into the context of having these hurricane-force winds in January, and then you have the ignitions. So we have climate whiplash, right? The wet to dry. We have this overabundance of fuels. We have the hurricane-force winds, and then we have ignitions that set it off. It's truly a perfect storm that led to these fires occurring. And I think it's really a critical example of the role that research can play. This is super complex stuff, right? And by teasing apart and understanding the causes and consequences, it allows us a more holistic perspective that might help us be prepared for these events in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's an example of climate change and wildfire in chaparral systems in Southern California. And so a lot of you, may be thinking about that when you think about fire. But a lot of people, when they envision fire, they think about fire in old-growth forests, ponderosa pine forests, or even, recognizing that coastal rainforests in the Pacific Northwest can burn. So it's complex. Fire is really different in these different systems. And, because of that, we have to recognize that the solutions are different in these different systems. So another question for Winslow. So, given that climate change is just one factor in the increase in fire activity that we're experiencing, what other factors are causing the increases in wildfire activity across the West. And yeah, tell us a little bit besides climate change, what should we be thinking about?
Absolutely. So let's just start with climate change and then we'll work through. So if you zoom out from LA to the entire Western United States, it's actually pretty clear that climate change is playing a dominant role. Since I was born, the annual area burned in forests of the Western US has increased tenfold. It's a ginormous increase. And you can see on the figure behind me, 2020 and 2021 were extraordinary years compared to the historical record, right? So we know that in forest ecosystems of the West, climate change is really important. But it's also important to know that it's not the only factor that matters, right? This accumulation of fuels from 150 years of suppression, both directly putting out fires, as well as through the extirpation of cultural burning by indigenous groups, has played a really important role as well, increasing the severity of fires, particularly in our dry forest ecosystems. So not all forests, but especially in the dry forest systems. A lot of it in California, of course. And then you add on top of that, layer on top of that, this expansion of the wildland-urban interface, or homes that are in wild lands where fire risk is high. And you have quite a situation that's challenging to think about solution sets at scale. So with the WUI perspective, for example, we've seen something like a 64% increase in the number of homes in WUI in the Western United States. And the number of homes that have experienced at least one fire during that time in the WUI has doubled. That leads to pretty complex things, right? We suppress fires that are close to homes, but also people start a lot of fires. And then you have those homes in the places where the risk is highest. So here we have climate change, we have accumulation of fuels, we have more people at risk. And one of the things that I think is actually quite striking is if you travel across Western North America, which I've done studying these fires from Alaska to New Mexico, there are a lot of similarities, but there's also a tremendous amount of difference. Ecosystems differ. It's like, individual stitches in a sweater that have their own unique little bits that you want to understand. And so if we're going to develop solutions that scale, it's both about understanding the local context of the ecosystems, the people and the communities, but also how that can be transferable to other locations and scale up to the Western United States. And that's exactly what WFRC is trying to do. We have a spatial domain of the Western United States, but we're also drilling down to understand the place-based nuance. And what we hope from that is we're able to develop transferable solution sets by addressing knowledge gaps that can really help us live more sustainably with fire and support our management community that has to help steward ecosystems and people through this time of change.
And Lara, do you want to add a little bit about the increasing fire activity? Yeah, and what's...
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that people may not appreciate about the graph that we're looking at here behind us is that with this increasing area of fire that we've seen recently, actually about half of the fire between 2010 and 2020 has actually been beneficial for those systems in the sense that it has reduced the fuel loads that were out there and the fire burned at a severity that was appropriate for the ecosystem. So this was a study that was done by a collaborator, Jennifer Balch, and she looked at all this area that burned across the West over that 10-year period, and basically determined that even within the footprint of fires that we think of as really large and really severe, there can be patches of those fires that burned in a way that was beneficial for the ecosystem and also reduced the risk of future fire in the near term. And the amount of area that burned in that time period actually more than doubled the amount of prescribed fire. So in the sense of, if we think about the work that beneficial fire might do on the landscape, there's prescribed fire where we're intentionally burning parts of the ecosystem, and then there's the wildfire, and the wildfire is a really important component as well. So this is just to say that there's a lot of nuance in terms of what's going on in the landscape, and I think this beneficial fire or good fire is also good to keep in mind as we go forward and try and develop solutions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of the complexity of the situation and the complexity of looking at fire. And I think research on fire science has really been moving forward, and at the same time, climate change really complicates that. So it's a little bit like, you're trying to move the ball down the field and the goalposts are moving at the same time. I think that's what makes fire research so important, to keep looking at the question, because the question itself is changing, right? The circumstances are changing in which we're evaluating fire as we think about how that interacts with climate change. So given these different factors contributing to area burned across the West, my next question is for Hilary. So there is no one-size-fits-all solution. We need to think about tailoring our solutions to different ecosystems. So what are some strategies used by land management agencies like Washington Department of Natural Resources? And how do strategies for managing fire in dry, fire-adapted environments differ from places like Los Angeles or wet forest, wet coastal environments?
Yeah, I think Washington State is actually a kind of a great example of, because we started, 2017 I started my role, and we kind of thought wildfire, sure, we'll have it 2 months out of the year. We'll ask for some help from Oregon and California and the feds, but we're out of the woods. It's really the southern states until 2014, 2015. 2 million acres burned total over those 2 years. And it was Washington State's wake-up call that what we'd been seeing in our southern states like California was coming to the Pacific Northwest, which, having grown up there, is cold, wet, and rainy, all but July and August. Not true anymore. And so we really realized we had to work fast because we had no resources. We had no work in forest restoration. We had no money for wildfire. We had 8 Vietnam War helicopters and 40 firefighters. We couldn't even compare to CAL FIRE. And we knew we needed to take a two-pronged approach, was that we were going to have the resources to respond to these fires that get significantly large because they threaten our forests and they threaten our communities, as we've seen in California and Washington now. And we also need to be rapidly accelerating the work in forest restoration so these forests can fight these fires on their own. We recognize too that our forests are not the same. We have the dry east side forests on the east side of the Cascades and the Olympic rainforest and the west side forests. And so we first started where the biggest challenge was, which is in central and eastern Washington, where 3 million acres of forest were already dead and dying. That's federal, state, tribal, and private lands. Developed a 20-year forest health plan. We said we are going to actually address the forest health issue the same way we fight fires, which is all hands, all lands. And so we took an all lands, all hands approach, being agnostic to property lines, so that we could work at a vaster pace and scale. We did it at a watershed level so that we were also looking at it comprehensively, and we started with the highest risk watersheds. The great news for Central and Eastern Washington, we are 7 years in and we are already halfway to our goal. So we are double downing and getting it done in half the time. The west side, and the west side forests a little more complicated. I say the west side forests are more complicated, so are the people. I live on the west side, so I can say that. But we don't have as much science as we need. The work has not been there yet because more of that focus has been on the Central and Eastern. We know what that area used to look like before and what needs to happen. And that work is going to take about 3 years. We also take a similar approach in the wildfire response, is that we don't treat every area the same. We recognize that we need to have resources available immediately to get on fires quickly when there are communities at risk. You've got lives at risk, you have water resources, which we're going to talk about, at risk. And so we very much work to get on those fires as quickly as possible in those high community centers, where we have more lands that are interspersed with federal lands that are far removed from people. We can take more of an approach of being able to sort of watch that fire. But I will be honest, the Labor Day firestorm, I think, was a wake-up call for all of the West Coast and the context around managed fire and quick response fire, and how we do that in a way that is ecologically responsive while also being responsive to the risk of lives of our communities and our firefighters.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. So we've talked a little bit about solutions, about management strategies, and we've talked about the science, so I want to bring those two together a little bit. So can you say a little bit more about how science and research have helped you in your organization to achieve your goals and to accomplish some of your forest and fire management strategies?
Yeah, so we believe very much that science must lead all work, that if we are not doing it with science in mind, we will fail ourselves, we will certainly fail our communities, and we will fail the future, and we will fail nature. And that nature's our best actual teacher. And so everything is built on a base of science. So first thing we did is actually assess all 3 million acres of those lands that were risk, and now we're going on to the next and the next and the next. And we looked back at time and what did these forests used to look like before humans were even walking. And then we also looked forward with climate change. How are these forests going to look? And the irony, or not an irony, but the wake-up call is, and you can see it in some of these forests right here. You see these clumps and gaps here, and I loved it. It reminded me of my fear when my kids didn't brush their teeth that they might have clumps and gaps. But when I learned forestry, this clumps and gaps really made sense. That fire used to come through when naturally before humans were interacting in it, and it would remove the dead, weaker trees. It'd create more space so there wasn't as much competition for the sunlight, for the water, for the nutrients. And so what we've done is look back at time at what it looked like, but we also recognize that not only is the space and gaps and the number of trees per acre changing, but also it is very likely that the types of trees are changing. So we're bringing that context of seedling diversification and into it. I will also say we then bring in the context of actually modeling. So there's a particular project where we did a forest health treatment, 800 acres. There was a fight. I'm just going to be frank. This is an issue that people are fighting over, right? And my scientists on one side was like 26 trees per acre. We're right. And the community organizations are like, no, it's 135 trees per acre. And the lawyer walks in and goes, can we just split the baby and otherwise this project's never going to get done and it's going to burn down. And so we actually did. We said, I brought all of my team of scientists that don't all agree. I learned that a long time ago, together. And so we decided we're going to do 60 trees per acre roughly, right? And very much the space and gaps. Literally that summer after we got that project done, fire came through. Now, the great thing is we got the project done, because I will tell you, a community would have been tragically burned down because there was so much fuel in the landscape that we removed. The great thing is we went back and we looked at it and go, 30 trees per acre. That's probably what it was supposed to be, because nature came back to fix the thing we didn't finish, right? But we are using that as an opportunity to go and learn as fire comes in, or as we see the treatment we've done, and even if before fire gets there. And the same is true after a burned area, severely burned, of what do we know? Yeah.
Great. And I want to give Lori a chance to answer this question as well. So from the built environment perspective, how do you see science and research playing into solutions?
Well, I think in the built environment, looking at communities, and one of the things that I try to focus on is, you've heard before, mission first, people always. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about. Is the mission is we've got to get ahead of wildfire and focus on the communities too, I believe. And so data and technology, and I say data first because I think the data are going to inform the technology that are necessary, but we have an absolute revolution, I believe, in the technology space around wildfire. Technology that is absolutely ramped up for the modeling to tell us where the fuels need to be mitigated, and that's in the communities and in the interface and in the wildland space. And by the way, those are 3 different landscapes, and so we should talk about them in those ways. Wildland fire is on wild land, vegetation. Wildland urban interface is when the vegetation meets the built environment, and then communities where we have structure-to-structure fire spread is a community or a conflagration. And so please be specific when we talk about those things. And so in the community space, this technology is prepared not only for detection with cameras and sensors, AI-enabled, by the way, that can be deployed. Satellite data, we've launched the first, the Earth Fire Alliance has a satellite that is modeling now and sending data, preparing to send data. We have to have some of our tech groups ready to ingest that data and use it. And so we have then the response capability. We've got everything from ballistic type missiles for response to drone swarms, that's hard to say, to all sorts of things that are in the suppression. And then, of course, the mitigation, which we should have started with in the fuels, everything from, masticators to these robots that are incredible for prescribed burning and extinguishment, all in the same fell swoop. And so technology and science, absolutely yes. We need a fire risk index. Sorry, I know I'm going long. A fire risk index, I have to say, do you know the one thing that is elusive right now is, Hilary, you said model the fire. We can do fire modeling, scale, scope, growth, all of those things, as long as it's only vegetation. When it hits the built environment, we cannot model. We do not have a fire risk index for the built environment. Google's working on it. They've got the Bellwether Project. We've got Headwaters Economics working on it. We've got the University of Boulder working on it. All of these things are happening, but until we get a fire risk index for the built environment, that is an elusive piece. And so that's the key to a lot of our data fusion and a real change in the built environment.
Great. I think those are lots of really great examples of the role of science and research and management solutions. And that's something that the Fire Collaborative is really trying to do, is kind of make that connection between the research that we're doing, the science, and make sure it is informed by people like Hilary and Lori, where they're talking about what they need and how they're going to use the science. So I do want to switch gears a little bit, talk about another aspect of fire. So, recognizing that wildfire does not exist in a vacuum, wildfire really affects a lot of the ecosystem services, the other resources that we care about, and one critical one is water. And so it's really important to think about also how science and research can help us understand the interactions between fire and water. So if you care about water, then you should probably think about fire too. And so the question I have for Lara is, what are some of the interactions between fire and water that we should be aware of, and what are some of the ways that water resources are expected to be affected in a future with more fire?
Yeah, thanks. So there are sort of three main things that I think of with respect to fire and water. So the first is water quantity. So when fire burns, it removes vegetation from the landscape. I'm talking about wildland fire here.
Excellent.
Trying to follow your. When wildland fire burns, it removes trees from the landscape. Trees use a lot of water. So if you take those trees away, trees use water to grow, right? And so when you take the trees or other vegetation off the landscape, then you have less of that water being used, and more water then ends up in the streams and rivers or in recharging the groundwater. And so you can have an increase in water yield, especially after large, severe wildfires, but usually only for a few years, maybe 5 or 6 years following big fires. As that vegetation grows back, it starts to use the water again. So water quantity can increase after large, severe fires. Another impact of fire related to water is impacts on water quality. And water quality changes for a number of different reasons. One reason, of course, is that if you remove all that vegetation, and especially if you remove the other, dead material in an ecosystem, you're exposing more soil to the air, and that soil can dry out. And when you get rain fall on the soil after the fire, it can increase erosion. So you get an increase in sedimentation into creeks and rivers and lakes and other water bodies, including our reservoirs. And so that increases the amount of silt and other sort of material that's carried. But it's also the case that burned up material, it doesn't burn all the way sometimes, and you end up with this what's called pyrogenic organic matter. So it's basically this partially burned material that gets into the water as well. And especially when you're talking about our reservoirs for our drinking water, that's material that needs to be cleaned out. And so when you increase the pyrogenic organic matter in our reservoirs, you increase the burden and the costs associated with water purification before we can have drinkable water. So this is one of the reasons why I think our watershed managers are particularly paying attention to this increased risk of wildfire, and in some cases are starting to really be a bit more proactive, developing strategies for reducing wildfire risk in watershed. I think it's not universal yet, but hopefully will be soon, that watershed managers are paying close attention. And then the last interaction I'll just briefly mention related to, well, I guess it's sort of related to water and wildfire, is the way that water moves through the landscape after a fire is really different, and the way that the soils and the land holds the water is different. And so with rainy seasons following a severe fire, for example, we can really increase the risk of landslides and debris flows. And we've seen this in California, for example, following the Thomas Fire, in Southern California, and in many other cases, you can have these really devastating debris flows that result from the loss of vegetation on the landscape and that increased risk. So a few different ways that water and wildfire can interact.
Great. And I do have another question about connecting that science to some of the management implications of water. But I think in the interest of time, we want to make sure to give you all some time to ask questions of our panel as well. So I think we'll go now to questions from the audience and give people an opportunity to ask questions. And we have questions in the room, and we'll also take some questions online.
So we'll start with an online question from our online viewers. How do those in the scientific community bridge communication gaps with the communities affected by wildfire about the importance of fire on the landscape?
I'm going to start, and then you probably should talk about that. But I want to start with the communication piece of that. We have to, as scientists, learn to translate science so that decision makers can understand it. Just publishing a paper and leaving it on a shelf or putting it in social media is not sufficient. We have to translate the science into practice and take theory and put it in actionable, recommendations that can be picked up by policymakers and decision makers, because that's the only way they know. They do not know the science, and I think it's imperative that as scientists that we do that translation.
Thanks for setting that up. And just to follow up, that's exactly what WFRC is trying to operationalize, right? We're trying to figure out how you take that last mile step of doing the science and then actually making it useful and actionable. And of course, the management and policy community is not a monolith, right? Everybody has different needs, different ways of accessing that information. And so over the last year, it's been such a privilege actually to work with Crystal, who's a professional in this space. And I've learned so much about what it takes. It really takes relationship building. It takes building that trust so that you understand what their needs are and they're receptive to the information because you've co-developed it together. So it might be derivative products like dashboards that people can use to look at their specific area. It might be briefs. It might be, just having a conversation, that trust where a manager will pick up the phone and call you and ask you questions informally. So there's lots of different ways to do it, but it's all about putting the energy in and listening and learning what people need.
So I was feeling bad that I didn't have the microphone there, but I can see I've trained Winslow pretty well. So he answered that question just as I would. So that's great. You've got it covered.
Hi, my name is Preet Anand. I wanted to follow up on Dr. Hansen's commentary. When you listen to a practitioner and they're sharing ideas with you, what does experimentation look like? And then from there, what is the process then to share those findings so it can be rapidly practiced among the community?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And maybe I'll take a stab at it and then pass it on to Crystal or Lara or others who also have experience with this. So I think experimentation can take a couple different forms, right? Actually, in the management community, for a long time, there's been this idea of adaptive management, of learning by doing and then assessing outcomes and adjusting strategies. So this is not new to the management community. But if you have those partnerships in place and you're co-developing that research together, I think you're bringing the strengths of both worlds. You're bringing the on-the-ground expertise and that knowledge of place that managers develop over long time periods of stewarding particular locations with the best available science. And so together, I think that's really kind of a rock star outcome of bringing these two worlds together to do exactly what you're saying, to experiment, to learn from our mistakes and improve. I think there's also a space for not just on-the-ground experimentation, but leveraging technology and process-based simulation on computers, because we can experiment at scales that we could never do responsibly in the real world because of the consequences that it might bring. I don't know, does anybody else want to jump in?
I just want to add one thing really quickly. One of the things that we often do is in science, we operate in ivory towers and we forget to ask the opinion of those who are actually boots on the ground that deal with fire every day. So I would suggest very strongly that you have firefighters, fire chief officers that are advisors to your science before you start your experiments, right? And include them along the way.
Absolutely.
And I'll just add, I think one of the reasons we were able to go so fast is we recognize the importance of science in institutions, universities, and elsewhere, but we also believe we need to have them in-house. Back to that room of scientists that I said they were disagreeing. I had the foresters who are out there that do the treatment. I've got the scientists from the forest management side to the forest health side, right? And even the firefighters in the room, who, right? And when you got them all in the room to really say, I know that landscape, and this is how I know that landscape, this is why I believe this, they all could wrestle with it, and then we actually put it on the ground and we're able to come back on that adaptive management. So I really truly believe in the strength of government, local, state, and federal, investing in the science within their own organization, coupled with the investments that are happening from philanthropy and universities and organizations.
Great, so we'll take another one from the online audience. How have the biggest concerns about wildfires changed over the last 10 years? And what do you see as the biggest concern with wildfires now?
Oh, don't get me started. Do you want to go first?
No, you take it and then I'll double down.
I mean, 10 years ago, Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, New Jersey, New York. I mean, the litany of them were like, yeah, we have wildfires, but they never get that big. They're never going to be that challenging. It's for California, not for us, right? Wake up. That is no longer the case, right? Some in Washington State would say fires are just on the east side of the state. I don't have to worry. I'm over in Seattle or the west side. No, we had more fires west of the Cascades than east of the Cascades in 2023 for the first time in recorded history. And I will tell you, that is the new trajectory we are going to be on over the next decade, right? And so what's happened is all of a sudden, state after state after state is realizing this is no longer just one state or a few states' problem or the federal government's problem. It is our own problem. And we're going to have to start taking a step up that says we're not going to rely on others to solve that problem for us, whether it's the federal government or the shared resources mutual aid, because California, Oregon, and Washington have great mutual aid agreements for decades, but the resources, we could never count on theirs, they could never count on ours because we're on fire at the same time. And so I think that critical investment must happen. That's what has changed the trajectory in Washington State, where now our fires, we're down, the acres burned are back to the levels of early 2000. For the first time in a long time. 95% of our fires are kept to 10 acres. We had 300,000 acres burned, while Oregon had 2 million acres burned, and we had the same number of fires. We had to invest in those resources, but we also said, we're not just gonna keep suppress. That's how we got into this. We are going to, at the same time, work at the pace and scale of restoring the health of forests, and every single state has got to own that problem, but then share those resources across states, share the knowledge and the experience across states that don't have fire at the same time. Like, I'm gonna start partnering with New Jersey.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that I said I would double down, we have a housing crisis, as you all know, that's in the media quite frequently. But building communities right in the path of fire is not the way to solve that, particularly if we're going to build them not to code. We have a science-based interface code that says if you're going to build in fire-prone lands, build with fire-resistant material. Thank goodness the governor of California is at least saying zone 0, 5 feet. We'd like to get to 10 feet. And by the way, it's just on new build. How about all the older structures, right? This is urgent. We cannot keep putting communities in the path of fire and think they're not going to burn. Because you take down trees and put communities there, the geography didn't change. It is still fire prone. And this is something people do not understand. So I think that's my greatest concern, is where we're putting people, and people don't know the risk. You think a real estate agent is going to tell you that this is a fire prone land? No. Look on Redfin or Zillow or wherever. Do they have fire prone risk in there? So they're starting to, but only now, right? So we have to inform people. So this is my concern. People in the path of fire.
David Saw, University of San Francisco. Great to hear you all talk. One thing that's interesting is with the takedown of the federal government, there still seems to be a concentration on wildfire and those specific elements. And then when you look at the tech sector, there's an acceleration in investments in the wildfire space as well. So there's this rapid acceleration of focus, resources, and knowledge development and gathering in this space. The question I have for you guys is, what's the value of open science in actually capturing and moving us forward as a community? Because what seems to be happening is that there's a fragmentation in knowledge gathering and deployment, whether it's within the response agencies we have here in the state of California, same sort of things happening within the insurance industries. There's a fragmentation of knowledge where we're not able to capture all the learnings that we're developing as a larger community.
I have to talk about data first, and then I'll hand it to you for the knowledge. But, you know, what you're saying, David, is absolutely true. We still operate often in silos, and this is in tech, it's in data, it's all of it. If we don't figure out how to de-silo and do data fusion and knowledge sharing and really start to mine all of our synergistic opportunities for real intelligence on how path forward in all of our landscapes, we're going to lose this battle. And so, to me, that is first and foremost is the de-siloing, the collaboration, and finding synergy. This is a big problem. There's space for everybody. So don't think about competition other than that makes you better, but think about collaboration along the way.
And I'm just going to add briefly, I think one of the phrases you said in your question is worth repeating, which is open science. I think one of the challenges we also face is making sure that a whole host of people have access to the information that is needed. As has been said so eloquently by Hilary and Lori, you know, there are communities at all levels, you know, from a local wildfire sort of protection nonprofit to the federal government, right? But they don't have equally deep pockets. And so we need people to have access to information that they can use to make that judgment for themselves, whether this is a fire-prone area, if the real estate agent isn't going to tell them. And so I think having an open science approach is super valuable when we're talking about public protection.
If I could just add, I love cooperation and the open science, I think is key. I think if we can all, I say this in every context, if we can all sort of take a lesson from actual firefighting, which is, you know, my motto is all lands, all hands, all together, we can solve any problem, right? And firefighters every single day are literally running into fires, right? And to save a life, to save a home that is not their home, not their neighborhood, sometimes not even their jurisdiction, right? Sometimes it's thousands of miles away in another state, right? That's where we need to get. That's the only thing that's going to save lives. That's the only thing that's going to actually address climate change and reverse the course we're on. And it's the only thing that's going to actually start to really fix our landscapes and heal our communities.
Great. Well, thank you very much for those answers. And I know we're nearing our time, but I do want to come back to the panelists for one more question. So I want to take a moment to talk about the federal administration and the federal situation right now, because I'm sure that's on everybody's mind as much as fire is. So I just want to acknowledge that I think we all feel that the federal administration is failing us right now on fire research, on support for community preparedness. And this failure hurts everyone, right? No one else can really completely fill those gaps. And so we're a little bit in triage mode at this point. And so I want each of our panelists to spend a minute or two, final thoughts, on answering the question, how can others step up to fill these gaps in the federal administration now, whether that's at the individual level, state governments, universities, private sector, philanthropy? How do we fill these gaps?
Are we gonna? Okay, I'm gonna start from the federal sector. And so I love the way you phrase that. Yes, it's like a kick in the gut having come out of federal government to see some of the things that are happening, particularly for science and around the fire space science. But I will say that I do have some hope that Congress is going to step up, and I'll tell you why. One of the bills that's tracking right now is called Fix Our Forest Act. And the Fix Our Forest Act already passed the House. Well, it was insufficient for communities. It would have addressed some of the wild land space, but it was bringing not a full solution to the problem. And so the Senate has taken up and added a large section on communities. They've also added an intelligence center, an environmental center. You may have heard it both ways, but that's a data fusion type center to try to understand. It doesn't go as far as we'd like, but it's something. And it actually embraces about a third of the recommendations that are from the Wildfire Commission that was under the infrastructure bill, right? And so there were 148 of those commissions, recommendations, about 50 of them are in this bill in some form. Some very blatantly in the bill, others just partially in the bill, but nonetheless, they are important. And so I'm hoping that the Senate version will go back, and during markup and hearings at the end of May, we're hoping to go back with the House and the collaboration of the conference committee, that they come out with a very strong Fix Our Forest bill that encompasses the community aspects, and we can have something to hold on to that includes science, it includes data, and includes some opportunity to make a real difference in all our landscapes.
So I'm generally a positive person, even after 8 years in politics. First, I do think I'm hopeful with the Fix Our Forest Act and a number of things that are happening. And I think because wildfire is a bipartisan issue, and because it is no longer just a West Coast issue, as we've seen, that it is impacting all of us. On the state level, I think, and the local level, I really believe this is where we're going to see an enormous amount of change over the next decade. And I'll just, if I can, just give a quick example. Labor Day firestorm, no one on the West Coast can forget it. It was 2020, Labor Day. Within 72 hours, we had over 90 fires. We had 600,000 acres burned, which is, I know nothing for Washington State. We were like, oh my God, it's Armageddon in 72 hours. We were calling for every air resource, every ground resource that we could get, and our calls weren't answered. And it's not because of failure of anyone, it's that there weren't enough resources to be found, and they were making values at risk judgments, meaning Oregon and California, because of many of their fires were closer to population centers, they were at greater risk, okay? Anybody would have made that decision, but it meant we were left with a type 3 on type 1 fires, on multiple type 1 fires with one type 3. It meant we still only had 10 aircraft when we needed over 50. Right? And that's when, in 2021, we said we are going to need to take our own destiny into our own hands and really show leadership. And we've transformed our wildfire response, and we've accelerated our forest restoration work and our community resilience, and passed the largest investment, $500 million, where our budget used to be zero. And it is now literally the model that I think other states that are smaller and don't have the funds and budget of California are utilizing to be able to say, we can't just rely on others. We have to put that work in place. So I have hope that the states are going to be stepping up. I see it already. I also believe local driving those resources at the federal and state level down to the local level is going to be so essential, because they know their communities, they know their landscapes, and they know how to get action done because it's their own communities at risk.
I guess one area for hope and area for action that I'll speak to just very briefly are partnerships that have been developed, that I've seen developed in California around giving tribal groups the ability to increase their burning. So essentially reactivating cultural burning on lands through co-management agreements. And I think this is really promising. It's an opportunity to return historically used fire into the landscape under the right conditions and for the right reason. But I think this is a really promising direction, and I think it sort of empowers individuals to be involved in a positive response, especially a community that has suffered so much in the past. And there are also local prescribed burn associations that people belong to, and I think there's a lot of energy there. And if you haven't ever participated in a prescribed burn, it's really fun. So get out there and see if you can participate. So I think there are actions that people can take beyond, well, in addition to clearing all of that vegetation within the first 5 feet of your home. And I know our local fire district in Berkeley is really starting to get on this. We have a horrible...
You just passed one of the most strictest codes of any place in the entire country when it comes to that 5-6 foot rule.
Yeah.
You're the new model everybody's going to be chasing down.
Yeah, and I'm going to start walking around through those hills and knocking on doors if people don't act on it, because it is a disaster up there right now. But anyway, there's a lot that individuals can do, and I think there's some hopeful community actions as well that people can and should be taking already.
All right.
No, I just want to double down on the individual piece for a moment, the home hardening, and that was really, the piece about, we come back to LA fires full circle, and what I said is the difference could have been made before the ignition, and that truly was about the fuel load. The combustibles, yes, vegetation, but yes, mulch, yes, garbage cans, yes, all the things that can burn outside your home. So individuals can, and I just want to make a note that if you choose to or you don't choose to, insurers are going to know one way or the other, and they're going to pay attention, because either you have risk and they will not insure you, or you reduce your risk and there's hope. And so the insurance, I think that agency has a lot of levers to pull, and that's not on the slide, but it's something I think we better pay attention to, is the role of the insurers. And I have to shout out 2 shout outs. One to Mega Fire Action, because they are really doing a lot of yeoman's work. If you're not familiar, look them up. And also the Alliance for Wildfire Resilience. That's where you'll find the commission report, because the commission report has been removed from all federal websites. So those 2 are really working at the federal level, and of course you're going to hear from the Moore Foundation shortly.
All right. I want to turn it to you, Winslow, for the last word. Let's bring it back to science and research.
I'll keep it short and sweet. I know everybody's coming at the end of their day. I think from a fire science perspective, we're actually, coming off of building a wonderful foundation. So the last 2 decades, we've seen tremendous progress of natural resource managers and scientists coming together to do actionable research. But the fact of the matter is environmental change is accelerating. The fire crisis has not been solved. And it's coming at this time politically where the clouds are stormy for fire and climate science. Let's not kid ourselves. The last few months have seen decades of impact. We've been set back decades. And so what is really needed right now, what we need to think about, is how do we bring together new partnerships between fire scientists, natural resource managers, philanthropy groups, and the private sector to innovate and to continue to accelerate to address key knowledge gaps. So why don't we come together as a call to action and envision a future that is sustainable, where we're living safely with fire, where ecosystems are thriving, and let's figure out how to get there with or without the current presidential administration. Thanks.
Okay, well, I want to thank all our panelists for incredible insights. That was really, really great conversation. Wildfire is here to stay. We can't look backwards. We can't eliminate it from our systems. We've tried to do that, and it doesn't work. So learning to live with fire, living sustainably with fire is definitely where we need to be. So now I just want to take a moment to hear from Jenny Biggs. And I want to thank Jenny Biggs for her support. So she is the program director of the Wildfire Resilience Initiative for the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And the Fire Collaborative is so thankful for the support from Jenny and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. So I just want to give you a few moments to close us out.
Thank you. I should know better than to go after this group. I want to say, first of all, thank you so much to this incredible panel. I am so grateful for the wisdom and experience that you've shared tonight, but I'm also so grateful to every single one of you for your leadership in really studying and solving the puzzles that we know need to be solved on this path to a more fire resilient future. I really appreciate the calls to individual action and collective action too. So thank you so much for that. And I also want to say thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. Those of you who are joining in person and those of you who are joining online. I like to say that wildfire is a really remarkable unifier. And that is a good thing because as we have talked, this is a big and a growing and an important challenge. And we all need to work together on this. We've got to roll up our sleeves, we've got to chip in together, and it's only going to happen if we all do that as one. I think the other thing that I really want to emphasize is just how important the critical research is that the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative does. As Preet asked the question, I mean, it's so important that they take the results that they're working on, the findings that they have, rapidly and synthetically work with decision makers and communities to then take those conversations and then refine the very questions that they're asking too. And that dynamic process is so important because we know fire regimes are changing, conditions on the ground are changing, so it needs to be a really dynamic process as we're thinking about how we can get to a future where we're able to live with and even thrive with fire. And so I would just say, if you're thinking about how you can pitch in, roll up your sleeves right now, join us in supporting this collaborative. We are so grateful for their work. It really is so critical. You can find the QR code that the team put together to do that. You can look at westernfireforest.org. And also, open invitation, come talk to me anytime. Those of you who know me know there's nothing I would rather do than talk about how amazing and inspiring our grantees are. So come, and I would love to do that and have a conversation anytime. So thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy. And I think that's a wrap.
Thank you for coming. We'll have the space until 6:30, so you're welcome to stay until 6:30. Have a good evening. Thank you for coming.